Our first reading is from the poet and human rights activist Alice Walker, called "To Change the World Enough." To change the world enough, you must cease to be afraid of the poor. We experience your fear as the least pardonable of humiliations. In the past, it has sent us scurrying off, daunted and ashamed into the shadows. Now, the world ending, the only one all of us have known, we seek the same fresh light you do, the same high place and ample table. The poor always believe there is room enough for all of us. The very rich never seem to have heard this. In us there is a wisdom of how to share loaves and fishes, however few. We do this every day. Learn from us, we ask you. We enter now the dreaded location of Earth's reckoning, not far off or hidden in books that claim to disclose revelations. It is here. We must walk together without fear. There is no path without us. The second reading is from Debbie Irving and her book, Waking Up White. My glorification of independence and individualism made me an easy target for the myth of meritocracy and overshadowed in my heart what I knew to be true, the deep interconnectedness I longed for with family, friends, colleagues, and even strangers is core to human survival. Interdependence is our lifeblood. And I'm just happy to be here. I actually love Stow and Acton as communities, and have ridden my bike around here and brought my kids to pick apples at Honey Pot Farm, and been chased by a lot of bees over there and that sort of thing. And I want to talk with you about this moment we're in, this kind of pulling apart, unequal moment, but from the perspective of somebody who grew up in the wealthiest 1%. My great-grandfather was the meat packer Oscar Mayer. So my dad used to say bringing home the bacon meant something really different in our family. And every couple of years I get together with 300 of my closest relatives, and we get the Wienermobile and dress up in German clothing and celebrate this remarkable ancestor of ours. But as a result of that, I grew up in a wealthy suburb of Detroit. I went to Cranbrook School, which is where Mitt Romney went. Our school motto is aim high, which is depicted by an archer shooting an arrow straight into the air, which, if you think about it, it's not something you would let your children do. But I really did grow up in a kind of a bubble of a remarkable community, but nonetheless a bubble, except for the fact that we were right next to the city of Detroit. And it was in those years after I left home, I had a lot of revelations, but one of them was I worked with tenant groups around New England, mobile home park residents who were trying to buy their mobile home parks, buy the land under them, and residents trying to buy their apartment buildings. And I had this like kind of amazing, intimate front row seat as our economy started to become more unequal. So in the 80s, I was working with residents and seeing how they were struggling as wages started to sort of flatten out and even fall in the late 70s and 80s. At the same time, growing up in a wealthy family and having friends and others, I could also see how wealth was accelerating and compounding at the high level. So I remember in the 90s, somebody said, we're becoming more unequal as a society. I was like, oh, I know exactly what you're talking about, because I've seen that and experienced it through people that I cared about along the different spectrum. And just thinking about the moment that we're in, we are in a moment where it's a time of extraordinary inequality. Half the population has not shared in the productivity gains and wage gains of the last 40 years. Meaning, think about that. Half the population hasn't seen their real wages go up in a generation. At the same time, most of the growth of both wealth and income has gone not just to the top 1%, but the top 1/10 of 1% households. And the higher we go up the economic ladder, the more concentrated wealth is now becoming. The wealthiest 400 individuals have as much wealth combined as the bottom 64% of the population. 3 billionaires, we know them, right? Jeff Bezos, Warren Buffett, Bill Gates. Combined wealth is equal to the bottom half of US households combined. And that's possible only because the rising ranks of underwater nation, people with zero or negative net worth, which are, it's almost 20%, 1 out of 5 households, zero or negative wealth. 30% of African American households, zero or negative wealth, nothing to fall back on. That's the moment that we're in. And if we don't sort of intervene to shift that dynamic, we're, as a number of people have pointed out, we're essentially kind of on autopilot to move toward a more, what I would call a racial and economic apartheid society. Now, as somebody who grew up as a beneficiary of that situation, I can now see more clearly than ever that it's actually in no one's interest to go in that direction further, to polarize further. We don't want to become like a Brazil, where wealthy people have gated communities and hire bodyguards to take their children to school and have more and more people feeling a sense of desperation and hopelessness. We don't want to go down that road. One thing I've noticed, though, is that these facts, the data that I mentioned, the almost uncontested picture of inequality, both income and wealth and opportunity, doesn't motivate everyone, and that there are powerful stories that justify these inequalities in people's minds. The oil billionaire J. Paul Getty was once asked, how do you become wealthy in America? And he said, it's really simple. There's 3 things you have to do. We could do a poll. How many of you got up early this morning? I mean, here they are at the 9 o'clock service. Just 2, he said, three things. 2, you got up early. 2, work hard all day. How many people will work hard all day, at least maybe tomorrow? Yeah. 3, find oil. Not olive oil either. So what I have learned is that when some hear those statistics about inequality, they say, well, it's a reflection of the fact that some people get up early, work hard all day, invent a useful mousetrap, take risks, and are worthy or deserving of that. That these inequalities are a reflection of effort and deservedness. And the shadow part of that story is if you don't have that kind of wealth or security, that you didn't get up early, didn't work hard, didn't work smart, that it's a reflection of deservedness. That is the most powerful story. Even on the radio, coming here this morning, there was a piece about gentrification in a community, maybe some of you heard, and one man was asked, well, what do you think about the people who are being displaced by these rising housing costs? He said, well, if you can't lift yourself up and work hard and earn enough, then you have to move. You don't deserve to be here. That story is so powerful. And yet, how do we change that? How do we shift that story? Because it's very hard to change a story. It's harder than changing a fact, or arguing a fact. I have a little clue into that, which is I heard a man speaking about why he thought he should pay an inheritance tax. And he's a high-tech kind of entrepreneur who you've never heard of. But he stood up at a press conference. His name is Martin Rothenberg. And he said, I oppose abolishing the inheritance tax that I will surely pay. but let me tell you why I think it's a good idea to keep it. And he said, I grew up, this is Martin speaking, I grew up in a poor family. My parents worked all the time. They never took a vacation. We never had money for anything extra. But I was able to go to a really good school. And I had high school teachers that got me interested in science. And I went to a library that was open till 9 o'clock on weeknights and open on the weekend. That was my sanctuary for study. And there was a librarian there. Every time I came in, she said, "Martin, I have a book for you." She knew I was interested in science and technology, and she would have a biography of a scientist or a book of experiments I could do in my apartment without burning it down. He said, my parents had no money, but so someone else paid for my education. Someone else paid for that library to be open. And then Martin says he went to college. He got a debt-free college education. Someone else paid, in his words, for him to go to college. And then he went to work in this emerging field of the internet and high technology, where he started a company. He said, "Where did I hire my employees? I went down the road and I hired them from the computer science labs of the public universities. Somebody else paid to train my workers in the foundation of knowledge that they needed to work for me." And he says, even a foreign corporation came and stole my intellectual property and was going to put me out of business. And the United States government went to several international tribunals and defended my private property rights and saved my business. He says, I didn't even know this whole structure existed, let alone did I pay for it. He says, so I sold my company for $30 million last year, and I have several other companies worth the same amount. And what you're saying is if you abolish this tax, I have no responsibility to pay back the society that made it almost entirely possible for me to get where I am. In fact, at that moment, he started to pound the podium and he said, I have a moral obligation to pay back so that some other young person who is as poor as I was when I grew up can have the same opportunities that I could have. Because what a good society does is it recycles opportunity. And people like me who have substantial wealth have an obligation to pay back, not just through charity, but by paying for that infrastructure of commonwealth. And I remember hearing that speech and thinking, wow, how often do you hear that kind of story? Because it wasn't a story that minimized his own individual effort. In fact, if you asked him, he would say, yeah, I got up early, I worked hard all day, I applied the gifts that I have. But what Martin was describing was the web, the commonwealth, the fertile ground we create together that makes life and success possible. And the good news is I keep hearing those stories all the time now. I work with these networks of entrepreneurs and thoughtful people who will lift up and say, individuals matter, individual effort matters, and look at this, the importance of this web, and we have to replenish that fertile ground, that commonwealth, if we want to keep the prosperity going. So I wrote a book, this book, Born on Third Base, in part to tell those stories, to break through the stuck debate about how this inequality moment that we're in. And it was, Tracy, you heard the blessing that literally it was like I was like an old-time missionary being, the laying on of hands almost, and being sent out into the world 17 months ago to tell stories and talk. And that blessing comes back to me whenever I venture out. I feel held by my congregation. It's a powerful thing. And the message that I now have found compelling, and I think about, and I've talked to I was invited by the people who own Bermuda to come and talk about what does it mean to deal with the extreme inequalities on the island of Bermuda. And my message to my people, my fellow one percenters, is to come home. There's 1,000 private jets went to Davos, Switzerland this week, where they discuss the world's unelected leaders, some of them elected, discuss the fate of the earth. But my message there is, come home, bring the wealth home. Bring it out from the tax havens, the hidden trusts, bring it back to the real economy of goods and services, of people, aspiring to have good lives here. Invest it in, take it out of the fossil fuel industry, which is moving us to the brink of catastrophic climate change, and put it in the new emerging energy economy, the new food systems, the economy that we can touch, feel, taste. Bring that wealth home, share the wealth, but realize that philanthropy is not a substitute for an adequately funded public sector and tax system and the like. Work to make government responsive. And I found that and also to tell true stories of how Advantage works, like Martin, lifting up not just individual stories of achievement, but describe the contours of that commonwealth, that web that makes life possible. So I've been on the road doing that, but I've also, to my message to everyone else, is we have to come together. We have to defend our communities against some of the attacks. We have to defend those who are most vulnerable in our wider communities. And I often am in a situation where people will say, well, what about the wealthy? Don't they, aren't they all greedy and careless? And I have to say, look, of course there are people who use their wealth and power to get more wealth and power, but that's a tiny, tiny segment. There's so many allies, potential allies. There's so many people who are out there waiting to be called to something more meaningful. And my lesson growing up in that affluent bubble is privilege is a disconnection drug. It kept me apart. It kept me from being in relationship and reciprocal relationships. And the antidote to that disconnection drug is connection, is inviting people home, to the table, to participate in fixing our futures. I was speaking at a very wealthy Episcopal church in suburban Los Angeles, and I had talked about, in my talk I said, the Boeing Corporation actually pays its CEO more than it pays in taxes every year, as one of the facts that I just sort of mentioned. And at the end of that program, a man came up to me. He was probably 6'5", tall, silver-haired gentleman, and he said to me, I used to be the number 3 guy at Boeing. And I thought, uh-oh. He said, I'm so embarrassed that our company took so much from the taxpayers of America and contributed so little to the caring for our veterans and the national parks and our education infrastructure. He said, but that's not why I came to talk to you. I have a question for you. But first I have to tell you, I worked for 40 years, but when I retired, I was an engineer when I was young, trained, and I've been working with these water treatment facilities in these rural villages around the world. And I was in Kenya, and I was helping a local village and local engineers build this water treatment facility. And every day I showed up there, and there were these children sitting under a tree. And I got to know them, and they got to know me, and they called me Uncle Hank. And one day I said, so where do you young people live? And they said, oh, Uncle Hank, let us show you. And they took me down a path, and over a little bridge, and we came to a large, tired, one-story wooden building, kind of about the size of this sanctuary. And it said orphanage. And Hank looked at these children who looked incredibly well cared for, and looked at this orphanage and said, so this is where you live? And they said, yeah, would you like to meet our adults? He said, sure. And he met some of the adults and the director. Hank told me, I went home that night to my first world hotel where I was staying while I was working in Kenya, and I lay awake all night long, looking at the ceiling, thinking about these children. And I went back the next day, and there they were. And at the end of my trip, I went to the director of that orphanage and I said, is there anything I can do to help you? And he said, as you can see, our building is very old and tired, and we're only able to help about a third of the children that we're able to help. And Hank says, so what happens to the other 2/3? And the director of the orphanage looked at him and said, I don't want to trouble you with that, sir. Hank said, try me. Tell me what happens. The director says, well, many of the children just we don't know what happens. They migrate into the large cities, but many of them are sold into slavery. And Hank says, oh. So he goes back to this wealthy Los Angeles congregation. He is a man on a mission. He organizes his peers. He says, I worked at Boeing. I would work with people of the highest integrity, the people you would want on your team to solve any problem. And I called on them, but I realized we had worked together, but we had never actually talked about poverty or inequality, and that we had powerful stories in our minds that justified the way the world worked. He said, but when I went to Kenya, I could not come up with a story that could justify the gap between my good fortune and the plight of those children. And then they cracked my heart open. And I came back to Los Angeles, and my heart was still open, and I began to see the structures of inequality in my own community. I began to see how wages and the food system and education and everything was contributing to these inequalities. He says, now I'm working all the time on these issues. This is all I care about, all that motivates me. He said, you didn't really talk about reparations, but how are we going to deal with the racial wealth, depth of the racial wealth divide without acknowledging the legacy of racism and slavery? And I'm thinking, okay, wait a second. The retired third-ranking guy at Boeing is asking me about reparations for slavery. And he looks at me, he says, my wife says to me, Hank, you kind of remind me of the sweet guy I fell in love with 40 years ago. You sort of have that twinkle back in your eye. And my children are saying to me, Dad, you seem younger than you were 20 years ago. You seem alive. And Hank said to me, so my question is, and I'm just like, oh, right, he's got a question. So my question is it too late for me to make a difference? And I'm thinking, no, it's not too late. In fact, you're doing exactly what I would hope many people would do. I said, we could use a few more like you. He says, oh, I'm working on that. You see, my generation, we need our hearts cracked open. So sometimes I have to take them to another country where the stories that justify these inequalities just can't hold up, and where other people's hearts are cracked open. Then I come back here and they are defenseless because they want to connect across these divides. So in closing, I would say, it's not too late. We can change this trajectory. We can change the stories that we hold these inequalities in place. And part of the path is through cracking open our own hearts and the hearts of others.